Okay.
Where are we starting?
Ralph edged forward. Good. Alright. Chapter 12, Lord of the Flies, Cry of the Hunters. Ralph edged forward, feeling his way over the uneven surface as though he were blind. There were miles of vague water at his right, and the restless ocean lay under his left hand, as awful as the shaft of a pit. Every minute, the water breathed around the death rock and flowered into a field of whiteness. Ralph crawled until he found the ledge of the entry in his grasp. The lookouts were immediately above him, and he could see the end of a spear projecting over the rock. He called very gently, "Sam and Eric." There was no reply. To Carrie, he must speak louder, and this would rouse those striped and inimical creatures from their feasting by the fire. He set his teeth and started to climb, finding the holds by touch. The stick that had supported a skull hampered him, but he would not be parted from his only weapon. He was nearly level with the twins before he spoke again. "Sam and Eric." He heard a cry and a flurry from the rock. The twins had grabbed each other and were gibbering. "It's me, Ralph." Terrified that they would run and give the alarm, he hauled himself up until his head and shoulders stuck over the top. Far below his armpits, he saw the luminous flowering round the rock. "It's only me, Ralph." At length they bent forward and peered into his face. We didn't know it was, we thought." Memory of their new and shameful loyalty came to them. Eric was silent, but Sam tried to do his duty. You got to go, Ralph. You got to go, Ralph. You go away now." He wagged a spear and essayed fierceness. "Shove off, see?" Eric nodded agreement and jabbed a spear into the air. Ralph leaned on his arms and did not go. "I came to see you two." His voice was thick. His throat was hurting him now, though he had received no wound. "I came to see you two." Words could not express the dull pain of these things. He fell silent, while the vivid stars were spilt and danced all ways. Sam shifted uneasily. "Honest, Ralph, you better go." Ralph looked up again. "You two aren't painted. How can you? If it were light." If it were light, shame would burn them in admitting these things, but the night was dark. Eric took up, and the twins started their antiphonal speech. "You got to go because it's not safe. They made us. They hurt us." "Who? Jack?" "Oh, no." They bent to him and lowered their faces. "Push off, Ralph. It's a tribe. They made us. We couldn't help it." Ralph spoke again, and his voice low and seemed breathless. "What have I done? I liked him. I wanted to be rescued." Again the stars spilled about the sky. Eric shook his head earnestly. "Listen, Ralph, never mind what is sense. That's gone. Never mind about the chief. You got to go for your own good. The chief and Roger, yes, Roger, they hate you, Ralph. They're going to do you. They're going to hunt you tomorrow." "But why?" "I don't know. And Ralph, Jack, the chief says it'll be dangerous. We've got to be careful and throw our spears like at a pig. We're going to spread out in a line across the island. We're going forward from this end until we find you. We've got to give signals like this." Eric raised his head and achieved a faint ululation by beating at his open mouth, and then he glanced behind him nervously. So that's this, right? Like the blah, blah, blah. You know, you guys understand that? Yep. Like that, only louder, of course. "But I've done nothing," whispered Ralph urgently. "I only wanted to keep up a fire." He paused for a moment, thinking miserably of the morrow. A matter of overwhelming importance occurred to him. "What are you?" He could not bring himself to be specific at first, but then fear and loneliness goaded him. "When they find me, what are they going to do?" The twins were silent. Beneath him, the death rock flowered again. "What are they? Oh, God, I'm hungry." The towering rock seemed to sway under him. "Well, what?" The twins answered a question indirectly. "You gotta go now, Ralph. For your own good. Keep away, as far as you can. Won't you come with me? 3 of us would stand a chance." After a moment's silence, Sam spoke in a string of voice. "You don't know Roger. He is a terror. And the chief, they're both terrors. Only Roger." Both boys froze. Someone was climbing down from the tribe. "He's coming to see that we're keeping watch. Quick, Ralph." As he prepared to let himself down the cliff, Ralph snatched the last possible advantage to be wrung out of this meeting. "I'll lay it close. In that thicket down here," he whispered. "So keep them away from it. They will never think to look so close." The footsteps were still some distance away. "Sam, I'm going to be all right, aren't I?" The twins were silent again. "Here," said Sam suddenly. "Take this." Ralph felt a chunk of meat pushed against him and grabbed it. "But what are you going to do when you catch me?" Silence above. He sounded silly to himself. He lowered himself down the rock. What are you going to do? From the top of the towering rock came the incomprehensible reply. Roger sharpened a stick at both ends. Roger sharpened a stick at both ends. Ralph tried to attach a meaning to this, but he could not. He used all the bad words he could think of in a fit of temper that passed into yawning. How could you go without sleep? He yearned for a bed and sheets, but the only whiteness here was the slow spilt milk, luminous around the rock 40 feet below where Piggy had fallen. Piggy was everywhere, was on this neck, was become terrible in darkness and death. If Piggy were to come back now out of the water with his empty head, Ralph whimpered and yawned like a little one. The stick in his hand became a crutch on which he reeled, and then he tensed again. There were voices raised on the top of Castle Rock. Sam and Eric were arguing with someone, but the ferns and the grass were near. That was the place to be in, hidden. And next to the thicket that was Sir Fitzmaurice's hideout, here, and his hands touched the grass, was a place to be in for the night, not far from the tribe, so that if the horrors of the supernatural emerged, one could at least mix with humans for time being, even if it meant... What did it mean? A stick sharpened at both ends. What was there in that? They had thrown spears and missed, all but one. Perhaps they would miss next time, too. He squatted down in the tall grass, remembered the meat that Sam had given him, and began to tear at it ravenously. While he was eating, he heard fresh voices, cries of pain from Sam and Eric, cries of panic, angry voices. What did it mean? Someone besides himself was in trouble, for at least one of the twins was catching it, and then the voices passed away down the rock, and then he ceased to think of them. He felt with his hands and found cool, delicate fronds backed against the thicket. Here, then, was the knight's lair. At first light, he would creep into the thicket, squeeze between the twisted stems, and conceal himself so deep that only a crawler like himself could come through. And that crawler would be jabbed. There he would sit, and the search would pass by him, and the cordon waver on, ululating along the island, and he would he would be free. He pulled himself between the ferns, tunneling in. He laid the stick behind him, and huddled himself down in the blackness. One must remember to wake at first light, in order to diddle the savages, and he did not know how quickly sleep came and hurled him down into a dark interior slope. He was awake before his eyes were open, listening to a noise that was near. He opened an eye, found the mold an inch or so from his face, and his fingers gripped into it, light filtering between the fronds of fern. He had just time to realize that the age-long nightmares of falling and death were past, and that the morning was come, when he heard the sound again. It was an ululation over the seashore, and now the next savage answered, and the next. The cry swept by him across the narrow end of the island from sea to lagoon, like the cry of a flying bird. He took no time to consider, but grabbed his sharp stick and wiggled back into the ferns. Within seconds, he was worming his way into the thicket, but not before he had glimpsed the legs of a savage coming toward him. The ferns were thumped and beaten, and he heard legs moving in the long grass. The savage, whoever he was, ululated twice, and the cry was repeated in both directions and then died away. Ralph crouched still, tangled in the ferns, and for a time he heard nothing. At last he examined the thicket itself. Certainly no one could attack him here, and moreover he had a stroke of luck. The great rock that had killed Piggy had bounded into this thicket and bounced there, right in the center, making a smashed space a few feet in extent each way. When Ralph had wriggled into this, he felt secure and clever. He sat down carefully among the smashed stems and waited for the hunt to pass. Looking up between the leaves, he caught a glimpse of something red. That must be the top of Castle Rock, distant and unmenacing. He composed himself triumphantly to hear the sounds of the hunt dying away. Yet no one made a sound, and as the minutes passed in the green shade, his feeling of triumph faded. At last he heard a voice, Jack's voice, but hushed. "Are you certain?" The savage addressed said nothing. Perhaps he made a gesture. Roger spoke. "If you're fooling us." Immediately after this, there came a gasp and a squeal of pain. Ralph crouched instinctively. One of the twins was there, outside the thicket, with Jack and Roger. "You're sure he meant in there?" "What happened?"
One of the twins got killed.
The twin moaned faintly and then squealed again. "He meant he'd hide in there?" "Yes. Yes, oh!" Silver laughter scattered among the trees. So they knew. Ralph picked up his stick and prepared for battle. But what could they do? It would take them a week to break a path through this thicket, and anyone who wormed his way in would be helpless. He felt the point of his spear with his thumb and grinned without amusement. Whoever tried that would be stuck, squealing like a pig. They were going away, back to the tower rock. He could hear moving, and then someone sniggered. There came again that high, bird-like cry that swept along the line. So some were still watching for him, but some... There was a long, breathless silence. Ralph found that he had bark in his mouth from the gnawed spear, and he stood and peered upward towards Castle Rock. As he did so, he heard Jack's voice from the top. Heave! 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 The red rock that he could see at the top of the cliff vanished like a curtain, and he could see figures in blue sky. So, essentially, he's right underneath where those giant, huge rocks were, right? And in fact, the rock that rolled off and pretty much killed Piggy at this point in time, he's sitting next to. A moment later, the earth jolted, and there was a rushing sound in the air, and the top of the thicket was cuffed with a gigantic hand. The rock bounded on, thumping and smashing towards the beach, while a shower of broken twigs and leaves fell on him. Beyond the thicket, the tribe was cheering. Silence again. Ralph put his fingers in his mouth, and he bit them. There was only one other rock up there that they might conceivably move, but that was half as big as a cottage, big as a car, a tank. He visualized its probable progress with agonizing clearness. That one would start slowly, drop from ledge to ledge, and then trundle across the neck like an outsized steamroller. Heave! 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 Ralph put down his spear and then picked it up again. He pushed his hair back irritably, took 2 hasty steps across the little space, and then came back. He stood looking at the broken ends of branches. Still silence. He caught sight of the rise and followed the diaphragm, and was surprised to see how quickly he was breathing. Just left of the center, his heartbeats were visible. He put the spear down again. Heave! 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 A shrill, prolonged cheer. Something boomed up on the red rock, and then the earth jumped and began to shake steadily, while the noise steadily increased. Ralph was shot into the air, thrown down, dashed against branches. At his right hand, and only a few feet away, the whole thicket bent and the roots screamed as they came out of the earth together. He saw something red that turned over slowly as a mill wheel. And then the red thing was past, and the elephantine progress diminished towards the sea. Ralph knelt on the plowed-up soil and waited for the earth to come back. Presently, the white, broken stumps, the split sticks, and the tangle of thicket refocused. There was a kind of heavy feeling in his body where he had watched his own pulse. Silence again. Yet not entirely so. They were whispering out there, and suddenly the branches were shaken furiously at 2 places on his right. The pointed end of a stick appeared. In a panic, Ralph thrust his own stick through the crack and struck with all of his might. Ah! His spear twisted a little in his hands, and then he withdrew it again. Oh! Oh! Someone was moaning outside, and a babble of voices rose. A fierce argument was going on, and the wounded savage kept groaning. And then there was silence. A single voice spoke, and Ralph decided that it was not Jack's. See? I told you. He's dangerous. The wounded savage moaned again. What else? What's next? Ralph fastened his hands around the chewed spear, and his hair fell. Someone was muttering, only a few yards away towards the castle rock. He heard a savage say, "No!" in a shocked voice, and then there was suppressed laughter. He squatted back on his heels and showed his teeth at the wall of branches. He raised his spear, snarled a little, and waited. Once more the invisible group sniggered. He heard a curious trickling sound, and then a louder creeption, as if someone were unwrapping great sheets of cellophane. A stick snapped, and he stifled a cough. Smoke was seeping through the branches in white and yellow wisps. The patch of blue sky overhead turned the color of a storm cloud, and then the smoke billowed around him. Someone laughed excitedly, and a shrill voice shouted, "Smoke!" So, they tried to get him out with the giant huge rock. Did that work? Nope. And now what are they doing? They're going to smoke him. They try to poke him, right, with their sticks. That didn't work either. So they're doing everything they can to get Ralph out of this like bramble of branches. Okay, can you envision this? Okay. He wormed his way through the thicket toward the forest, keeping as far as possible beneath the smoke. Presently, he saw open space in the green leaves of the edge of the thicket. A smallish savage was standing between him and the rest of the forest, a savage striped red and white and carrying a spear. He was coughing and smearing the paint about his eyes with the back of his hand as he tried to see through the increasing smoke. Ralph launched himself like a cat, stabbed, snarling with the spear, and the savage doubled up. There was a shout from beyond the thicket, and then Ralph was running with the swiftness of fear from the undergrowth. He came to a pig run, followed it for perhaps 100 yards, and then swerved off. Behind him, the ululation swept across the island once more, and a single voice shouted 3 times. He guessed that it was a signal to advance, and sped away again until his chest was like fire, and then he flung himself down under a bush and waited for a moment until his breathing steadied. He passed his tongue tentatively over his teeth and lips and heard far off the ululation of the pursuers. There were many things he could do. He could climb a tree, but that was putting all of his eggs in one basket. If he was detected, they had nothing more difficult than to just wait for him. If only one had time to think. And we know that he kind of struggles with that already, right? That automatic, like making a decision. Sometimes that curtain drops and he struggles with working through things. Okay, he processes a little bit more slowly than what Piggy did. Another double cry at the same distance gave him a clue up to their plan. Any savage bulked in the forest would utter the double shout and hold up the line until he was free again. That way they might hope to keep the cordon unbroken right across the island. Ralph thought of the boar that had broken through with such ease. If necessary, when the chase came too close, he could charge the cordon while it was still thin, burst through, run back, but run back to where? The cordon would turn and sweep again. Sooner or later, he would have to sleep or eat, and then he would awaken with hands clawing at him, and the hunt would become a running down. What is this like? What is this story like?
Um,
Kind of like the Hunger Games. What else?
That book we read at the beginning of the school year.
What was the title of that short story?
Oh, it's
The Most Dangerous Game. You guys remember reading that?
they chased after that girl with rocks.
Not the
No,
girl.
the guy and the
No.
hunter.
Yeah, it's whenever you had Zaroff and Rainsford, and he lands on the island, and it turns out that he's actually hunting men.
Oh,
What was to be done then? The tree? Burst the lines like a boar? Either way, the choice was terrible. A single cry quickened his heartbeat, and leaping up, he dashed away towards the ocean side in the thick jungle until he was hung up among creepers. He stayed there for a moment with his calves quivering. If only one could have a long pause, a time to think! And there again, shrill and inevitable, was the ululation sweeping across the island. At that sound, he shied like a horse among the creepers, and ran once more until he was panting. He flung himself down by some ferns, the tree or the charge. He mastered his breathing for a moment, wiped his mouth, and told himself to be calm. Sam and Eric were somewhere in that line, and hating it. Or were they? And supposing instead of them he met the chief or Roger who carried death in his hands? Ralph pushed back his tangled hair and wiped the sweat out of his best eye, and he spoke aloud. Think. What was the sensible thing to do? There was no Piggy to talk sense. There was no solemn assembly for debate nor dignity of the conch. Think. Most, he was beginning to dread the curtain that might waver in his brain, blacking out the sense of danger, making a simpleton of him. A third idea would be to hide so well that the advancing lion would pass without discovering him. He jerked his head off the ground and listened. There was another noise to attend to now, a deep grumbling noise, as though the forest itself were angry with him. A somber noise across which the ululations were scribbled excruciatingly as on a slate. He knew he had heard it before somewhere, but had no time to remember. Break the line. A tree. Hide and let them pass. A nearer cry stood him on his feet, and immediately he was away again, running fast among thorns and brambles. Suddenly he blundered into the open, found himself again in that open space, and there was the fathom-wide grin of the skull, no longer ridiculing a deep blue patch of sky, but jeering up into a blanket of smoke. And then Ralph was running beneath trees, but the grumble of the forest explained. They had smoked him out and set the island on fire. Hide was better than a tree because you had a chance of breaking the line if you were discovered. Hide then. He wondered if a pig would agree and grimace at nothing. Find the deepest thicket, the darkest hole in the island, and creep in. Now as he ran, he peered about him. Bars and splashes of sunlight flitted over him and sweat glistened streaks on his dirty body. The cries were far now and faint. At last he found what seemed to him the right place, though the decision was desperate. Here the bushes and a wild tangle of creeper made a mat that kept all of the light of the sun out. Beneath it was a space, perhaps a foot high, though it was pierced everywhere by parallel and rising stems. If you wormed into the middle of it, then you could be 5 yards from the edge and hidden, unless the savage chose to lie down and look for you, and even then he would be in darkness. And the worst that happened, he saw you, then you had a chance to burst out at him, fling the whole line out of step, and then double back around. Cautiously, his stick trailing behind him, Ralph wormed between the rising stems, and when he reached the middle of the mat, he lay and he listened. The fire was a big one, and the drum roll that he had thought was left so far behind was nearer. Couldn't a fire outrun a galloping horse? He could see the sun splash ground over an area of perhaps 50 yards from where he lay, and as he watched, the sunlight in every patch blinked at him. This was so like the curtain that flapped in his brain that for a moment he thought the blinking was inside of him. But then the patches blinked more rapidly. dulled and went out, so that he saw that a great heaviness of smoke lay between the island and the sun. So they've caught this whole thing on fire. This is not like the first fire that we saw in this book. They have just decided we're going to burn it all down to try to find him. Does that tell you a little bit about their rationality? Okay. Okay, well, we'll risk everything just to kill this kid. If anyone peered under the bushes and chanced to glimpse human flesh, it might be Sam and Eric who pretend not to see anything. He laid his cheek against the chocolate-colored earth, licked his dry lips, and closed his eyes. Under the thicket, the earth was vibrating very slightly, or perhaps there was a sound beneath the obvious thunder of the fire and the scribbled ululations that were too low to hear. Someone cried out. Ralph jerked his cheek off the earth and looked into dulled light. They must be near now, he thought, and his chest began to thump. Hide, break the line, climb a tree. What was the best after all? The trouble was, you only had one chance. And now the fire was nearer. Those volleying shots were great limbs, trunks even bursting. The fools! The fools! The fire must be almost at the fruit trees. What would they eat tomorrow? Ralph stirred restlessly in his narrow bed. One chance, nothing. What could they do? Beat him? So what? Kill him? A stick sharpened at both ends. The cry, suddenly nearer, jerked him up. He could see a striped savage moving hastily out of the green tangle and coming toward the mat where he hid, a savage who carried a spear. Ralph gripped his fingers into the earth. Be ready now, in case. Ralph fumbled to hold the spear so that it was point foremost, and now he saw that the stick was sharpened at both ends. The savage stopped 15 yards away and uttered his cry. Perhaps he can hear my heart over the noises of the fire. Don't scream, get ready. So who's out there right now?
Rogers.
The savage moved forward so that you could see only him from the waist down, and that was the butt of a spear. And now you could see him from the knees down. Don't scream. A herd of pigs came squealing out of the greenery behind the savage and rushed away into the forest. Birds were screaming, mice were shrieking, and a little hopping thing came under the mat with him and cowered. What's happening? Why are these animals acting this way? Okay, so now we're understanding that piece too. 5 yards away, the savage stopped, standing right by the thicket, and cried out. Ralph drew his feet up and crouched. The stake was in his hands, the stake sharpened at both ends, the stake that vibrated so wildly, that grew long, short, light, heavy, light again. The ululation spread from shore to shore. The savage knelt down by the edge of the thicket, and there were lights flickering in the forest behind him. You could see a knee to serve the mold, and now the other, 2 hands, a spear, a face. The savage peered into the obscurity beneath the thicket. You could tell that he saw light on this side and on that, but not in the middle. There, in the middle was a blob of dark. The savage wrinkled up his face, trying to decipher the darkness. The seconds lengthened. Ralph was looking straight into the savage's eyes. Don't scream. You'll get back. Now he's seen you. He's making sure. A stick sharpened. Ralph screamed, a scream of fright and anger and desperation. His legs straightened, the screams became continuous and foaming. He shot forward, burst the thicket, was in the open, screaming, snarling, and bloody. He swung the stake and the savage tumbled over, but there were others coming toward him, crying out. He swerved as the spear flew past him and then was silent, running. All at once, the lights flickering ahead of him merged together, and the roar of the forest rose to thunder, and a tall bush directly in his path burst into a great fan-shaped flame. He flung to the right, running desperately fast with the heat beating on his left side and the fire racing forward like a tide. The ululation rose behind him and spread along, a series of sharp cries, a sighting call. A brown figure showed up at his right and fell away. They were all running, all crying out madly. He could hear them crashing in the undergrowth. And on the left was the hot, bright thunder of the fire. He forgot his wounds, his hunger and thirst, and became fear. Hopeless fear on flying feet, rushing through the forest toward the open beach. Spots jumped before his eyes and turned into red circles that expanded quickly until they passed out of sight. Below him, someone's legs were getting tired, and the desperate ululation advanced like a jagged fringe of menace and was almost overhead. He stumbled over a root, and the cry that pursued him rose even higher. He saw a shelter burst into flames, and the fire flapped at his right shoulder, and there was the glitter of water. And then he was down, rolling over and over in the warm sand, crouching with arm to ward off, trying to cry for mercy. He staggered to his feet, tense for more terrors, and looked up at a huge peaked cap. It was a white-topped cap, and above the green shade of the peak was a crown, an anchor, green foliage. He saw a white drill, epaulets, a revolver, a row of gilt buttons down the front of a uniform. A naval officer stood on the sand looking down at Ralph in wary astonishment. On the beach behind him was a cutter, her bows hauled up and held by 2 ratings. In the stern sheets, another rating held a submachine gun. The ululation faltered and died away. The officer looked at Ralph doubtfully for a moment and then took his hand from the butt of his revolver. "Hello." Squirming a little conscious of his filthy appearance, Ralph answered shyly, "Hello." The officer nodded as if question had been answered. "Are there any adults, any grown-ups with you?" Dumbly, Ralph shook his head. He turned a half pace on the sand. A semicircle of little boys, their bodies streaked with colored clay, sharp sticks in their hands, were standing on the beach making no noise at all. "Fun and games," said the officer. The fire reached the coconut palms by the beach and swallowed them noisily. A flame, seemingly detached, swung like an acrobat and licked up the palm heads on the platform. The sky was black. The officer grinned cheerfully at Ralph. "We saw your smoke. What have you been doing? Having a war or something?" Why is that ironic?
Because they are.
Because they're having a war.
They're literally having a war on that island right now as he shows up. What's even more ironic about that statement?
World War II.
The only reason they're on that island is because their parents tried to get them away from a war. Right? So that war they tried to get them away from, they weren't going to be on the front lines, right? They might have experienced some horrible things. They might have been killed by a bomb dropping. But to get them away from it, now they've put them through this experience, this war experience. That's the ironic part about it. Ralph nodded. The officer inspected the little scarecrow in front of him. The kid needed a bath, a haircut, a nose wipe, and a good deal of ointment. "Nobody killed, I hope. Any dead bodies?" "Only 2. And they've gone." The officer leaned down and looked closely at Ralph. 2? Killed? Ralph nodded again. Behind him, the whole island was shuddering with flame. The officer knew as a rule when people were telling the truth, and he whistled softly. Other boys were appearing now, tiny tots, some of them, brown, with the distended bellies of small savages. One of them came close to the officer and looked up. I'm. But there was no more to come. Percival Wemyss Madison sought in his head for an incantation that had faded clean away. So he doesn't even know who he is at this point in time, right? Remember that little boy that he stood up, he said his whole name, he said his address, and then he couldn't remember his phone number, and he kind of faltered and he started crying because he'd forgotten it already. Now he does not even know his name.
Who is it?
Percival Wemyss Madison.
Oh.
The officer turned back to Ralph. "We'll take you off. How many of you are there?" Ralph shook his head. The officer looked past him to the group of painted boys. "Who's boss here?" "I am," said Ralph loudly. A little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cap on his red hair and who carried the remains of a pair of spectacles at his waist started forward, changed his mind, and stood still. Who was that boy?
Yeah.
Okay, is he a real leader?
No.
No, it's time to answer for some things, right? Now he's not going to be the leader. "We saw your smoke, and you don't know how many of you there are?" "No, sir." "I should have thought," said the officer as he visualized the search before him. "I should have thought that a pack of British boys, you're all British, aren't you, would have been able to put together a better show than that. I mean, it was like that at first," said Ralph, "before things..." He stopped. "We were together then." The officer nodded helpfully. "I know, jolly good show, like the Coral Island." Ralph looked at him dumbly. For a moment, he had a fleeting picture of a strange glamour that had once invested the beaches. But the island was scorched up like dead wood. Simon was dead, and Jack had... The tears began to flow, and sobs shook him. He gave himself up to them now, for the first time on the island, great shuddering spasms of grief that seemed to wrench his whole body. His voice rose under the black smoke before the burning wreckage of the island, and infected by that emotion, the other boys began to shake and sob too, and in the middle of them, with filthy body, matted hair, and unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true, wise friend called Piggy. The officer, surrounded by these noises, was moved and a little embarrassed. He turned away to give them time to pull themselves together and waited, allowing his eyes to rest on the trim cruiser in the distance.